The morning of October 3rd, 1924 arrived in Marrow Hill with a peculiar quality of light that only New England autumns can produce. Golden, yet somehow melancholic, as if the sun itself knew winter was stalking just beyond the horizon. Our mason, a man of 43 years, who had spent more than half his life coaxing beauty from stone, stood in his workshop doorway breathing in air that tasted of wood smoke and dying leaves. The town, 7 miles northwest of Salem, carried its proximity to that infamous place like a person might carry a slight limp, always present, never quite forgotten, occasionally convenient for tourists seeking authentic witchcraft tales. His workshop occupied the ground floor of a narrow brick building on Carpenter Street, a name that amused him, given his own trade. Above, his modest apartment consisted of 3 rooms that Mrs. Elena Rossetti, his landlady, kept threatening to modernize with electric lighting throughout, though he preferred his oil lamps for reading. "Electric light," she would say in her accented English, "makes the shadows too sharp, but you like the old ways too much." Perhaps he did. His father, who had brought the family from Carrara when our mason was barely walking, had taught him that stone remembered everything. Every chisel strike, every weather pattern, every prayer whispered over a grave. The workshop still contained his father's tools, worn smooth by 2 generations of hands, arranged precisely on the wall beside newer implements that seemed almost embarrassed by their shine. That particular morning held promise of something different. A letter had arrived the previous evening, delivered by a nervous boy who'd waited, shifting from foot to foot, while the mason read it twice. Cornelius Blackwood requested his services for restoration work on the family crypt. The Blackwoods. Now there was old money, the kind that grew in Marrow Hill's soil long before the Revolution, watered by commerce in timber, shipping, and activities best not examined too closely. The mason's father would have called them stone-heavy people, meaning those whose wealth pressed down on everyone around them, creating permanent impressions. Tommy Fitzgerald burst through the workshop door at 7:30, bringing with him the energy that only 19 years can produce. "Morning, sir. Did you see the letter?" The boy, though he'd bristle at being called that, had been apprenticing for 2 years now, his enthusiasm for the craft genuine, even if his attention sometimes wandered to the young women who passed the workshop windows. "I saw," the mason replied, already mixing mortar for their current project, a modest headstone for the widow Harrison. "We'll finish Mrs. Harrison's stone first. The dead are patient, but the living bereaved are not." Tommy's face fell slightly. Here was youth, always rushing toward the next grand thing, never understanding that craftsmanship lived in the small, careful moments. The Blackwood crypt was prestigious, certainly, the kind of commission that could establish a reputation. But the mason had learned to be cautious around prestige. It had teeth. The workshop filled with the familiar rhythm of work, the whisper of sandpaper on granite, the tap of chisel on stone, the scrape of trowels spreading mortar. These sounds formed a meditation that connected him to centuries of masons before him, men who had built cathedrals and carved gargoyles, who had marked the passages of lives with dates and epitaphs. Sometimes he wondered if his father had been right to leave Italy, to trade the marble quarries for this New England granite. But stone was stone, and the dead needed marking everywhere. Mrs. Rossetti appeared at noon, as she always did, with a lunch that could have fed 3 men. "You're too thin," she announced, though he hadn't changed weight in 5 years. "And this Blackwood business," she crossed herself quickly, "those are unlucky people. My cousin's daughter, she worked in their house 10 years ago, said the walls themselves were cold, even in summer. The mason accepted the food gratefully, knowing better than to argue. Mrs. Rossetti had appointed herself his guardian after his return from the war, not the recent one, but the earlier conflict in the Philippines, where he'd built fortifications instead of monuments. She'd lost her husband and 3 sons to the influenza in 1918, and her mothering had nowhere else to go. That afternoon, Father Michael O'Brien stopped by, as he did every Thursday, ostensibly to check on the progress of a small repair to the church's cornerstone, but really to share a pipe and gossip.
The Blackwoods, eh? He raised an eyebrow. Interesting timing. Old Cornelius is poorly. Has been since August. The consumption, they say, though Theodore calls it a chest cold when he's in his cups at the club. The mason continued polishing the widow Harrison's stone, letting the priest talk. Information came to those who didn't appear to seek it. Father O'Brien mentioned the 2 sons, Theodore the banker, steady and cold as January, and Jasper the dreamer, who'd lost a fortune trying to manufacture automobiles just as Ford had cornered the market. He spoke of Margaret, Theodore's wife, who'd been a medium before marriage, conducting seances for Boston society before respectability demanded she abandon such pursuits. As evening approached and Tommy swept the workshop floor, the mason stood before his father's photograph, the only decoration on the walls besides tools. His father's eyes, frozen in sepia, seemed to hold a warning. "Trust the stone," he used to say, "never the men who buy it." The Blackwood family crypt squatted on the northern edge of Marrow Hill Cemetery like a gray toad made of granite and limestone, imposing in its simplicity. October 7th had dawned crisp and clear, the kind of morning that made the mason grateful for his wool coat, as he and Tommy approached the iron fence that separated the Blackwood section from the rest of the graves. The fence itself told stories, wrought in the 1850s according to the pattern of its fleur-de-lis finials, and beginning to show the particular kind of rust that came from proximity to the sea. Theodore Blackwood waited for them at the crypt entrance, checking his pocket watch with the frequency of a man who measured his worth in other people's time. At 38, he carried himself with the rigid posture of someone who'd been told since childhood that he would inherit everything and had shaped his spine accordingly. "You're punctual," he said, as if granting absolution. "Father appreciates that. He would have been here himself, but the morning air—" He let the sentence die, apparently finding even the mention of weakness distasteful. The mason nodded, already studying the crypt's facade. The limestone blocks showed their age, 170 years if the cornerstone's date was accurate, with the particular weathering pattern that came from New England winters. But there was something else, something that made him step closer while Tommy unpacked their examination tools. Along the mortar lines, especially on the eastern face, dark stains ran down like tears from a mourner's eyes. They were rust-colored in some places, deeper burgundy in others. "The bleeding," Theodore said, his voice carefully neutral. "That's what the locals call it. Superstitious nonsense, of course. Water damage, obviously. Father wants it stopped before—" Again, that meaningful pause. Before he died, the mason understood, though neither would say it. A carriage arrived then, its wheels crunching on the gravel path. Jasper Blackwood emerged, moving with the studied casualness of a man trying to appear sober. At 32, he had the soft look of someone who'd never quite found his footing in the world. His clothes were expensive, but worn carelessly, his collar slightly askew. "Brother," he said, the word carrying enough edge to cut glass. I see you've begun the exorcism. Theodore's jaw tightened. Mr. Romano is here to repair water damage, nothing more. The mason noticed how neither brother looked directly at the other, like magnets with matching poles. Jasper approached the crypt wall, running his fingers along one of the darker stains. Water damage? Is that what we're calling it now? Our great-great-grandmother Constance would be amused. She's the one who cursed it, you know, he said to the mason. When they forced her to marry a Blackwood instead of her sailor boy, said the stones would weep blood until the family line ended or love returned to it. Fairy tales, Theodore snapped, but the mason noticed how he stepped back from the wall. Tommy, meanwhile, had been examining the foundation with the enthusiasm of youth discovering something significant. Sir, look at this pattern. It's not random at all. The stains, they follow the mortar lines, but only on certain blocks. The boy was right. The mason knelt, grateful for the excuse to ignore the brothers' sniping, and examined the stones more closely. The affected blocks had a different texture, slightly more porous than their neighbors. When he scraped a sample with his knife, the powder that came away had a faint reddish tinge even when dry. Iron oxide, perhaps, though that wouldn't explain the selective staining. Inside the crypt, the atmosphere changed immediately. The temperature dropped 10 degrees, and the air held that particular stillness that came from spaces rarely disturbed. 12 stone sarcophagi, arranged in neat rows, each bearing a Blackwood name and dates that stretched back to the 1750s. The interior walls showed the same staining pattern. But here, something else caught the mason's attention, a faint, earthy smell, like mushrooms or wet forest floor. "It's worse during the full moon," Jasper said from the doorway, not entering. "The bleeding, I mean. October 21st will be the next one. You should see it then. Father never comes here during the full moon, neither does Theodore, for all his talk of superstition." Theodore's face flushed. "I have better things to do than indulge your dramatics." The mason made notes in his small leather journal, sketching the stain patterns and recording which blocks were affected. Tommy measured the walls with string and stakes, creating a grid system they could reference later. Professional, methodical work, the kind that revealed truth through patience rather than assumption. As they worked, the mason became aware of being watched. A woman stood by the fence, dressed in dark green wool that looked expensive even from a distance. Margaret Blackwood, he realized, though she made no move to approach. She simply observed, her face unreadable beneath her hat's brim. When Theodore noticed her, his entire demeanor shifted, becoming somehow both harder and more brittle. "We should go," Theodore announced abruptly. "You have what you need for your initial assessment." The mason nodded, though he wanted more time. Something about the crypt nagged at him, some detail his mind hadn't quite grasped. But one didn't argue with Blackwoods. As they packed their tools, he noticed Tommy carefully scraping something into a sample jar. Moss, it looked like, reddish-brown and growing in the shadowed corners where the stains were darkest. Back at the workshop that evening, the mason spread his notes across his desk, while Tommy prepared samples for closer examination. The pattern was clear now. The staining occurred only on blocks quarried from a specific source. Limestone with an unusually high iron content, according to his geological references. But that alone wouldn't cause the dramatic bleeding effect the locals whispered about. "Sir," Tommy said, peering through the mason's magnifying glass at the moss sample. "This is the strangest thing.
It's almost like it's feeding on the iron in the stone. The mason looked for himself. The boy was right again. The moss had tiny filaments that seemed to penetrate the limestone's porous surface. He'd need to consult with someone more knowledgeable about botanical matters. Dr. Pemberton, perhaps, the town physician who fancied himself a naturalist. That night, unable to sleep, the mason stood at his window looking toward the cemetery. The Blackwood crypt was invisible from here, but he could feel its presence somehow, like a tooth that ached before a storm. His father would have said some stones wanted to tell their stories. The trick was learning how to listen. The Marrow Hill Public Library occupied a building that had once been a sea captain's mansion, its rooms still carrying the faint smell of salt and old adventures. October 10th found our mason among its stacks, searching through volumes that most residents ignored. Property records, genealogies, geological surveys dating back to the 1840s. Tommy sat across from him at the heavy oak table, dutifully copying passages about limestone composition, though his attention kept drifting to Miss Catherine Wells, the librarian's assistant, who seemed to need to reorganize the nearby shelves with unusual frequency. The Blackwood family history read like a Gothic novel missing its final chapters. Constance Blackwood, née Thornfield, had indeed existed, married in 1793 to Josiah Blackwood, dead by 1795 under circumstances the records called a wasting illness of peculiar character. The mason found her death certificate, signed by a Dr. Elias Crow, who noted severe anemia and delirium as contributing factors. 3 of her 4 children had died young, leaving only Solomon to carry on the family name. "Listen to this," the mason said quietly, causing Tommy to tear his gaze away from Miss Wells. "The limestone for the crypt came from the Hartwell Quarry, closed since 1872 after repeated accidents and unstable mineral composition. The quarry was known for its high iron content. They called it bloodstone locally." Tommy leaned forward, genuinely interested now. "So the stone itself is unusual?" The mason nodded, but his thoughts were already moving ahead. Natural phenomena often became supernatural in the telling, especially when they coincided with family tragedies. The Blackwoods had certainly had their share. Suicide, madness, children dead before their time. Each generation seemed to produce at least one member who ended badly, fueling the curse narrative. Mrs. Rossetti was waiting when they returned to the workshop, her face creased with concern. "That Tommy Fitzgerald's mother came by," she said, managing to make the boy's full name sound like an accusation. "Says you're keeping him out late, filling his head with unholy things about that crypt." Tommy flushed red. "Ma worries too much. I only mentioned the moss, and she started going on about witch's hair and devil's brew." The mason sighed. In a town this close to Salem, even innocent observations could spark old fears. He sent Tommy home early, with instructions to reassure his mother that they were simply repairing stonework, nothing more. The boy left reluctantly, casting one last look at the samples they'd collected. Alone in his workshop, the mason prepared his restoration materials. The mortar would need to match the original composition as closely as possible: lime, sand, and horsehair for binding, though he'd add a modern waterproofing compound to prevent future seepage. The iron-rich limestone would be more challenging. He couldn't replace all the affected blocks without essentially rebuilding the entire crypt, which the Blackwoods certainly wouldn't authorize. A knock interrupted his calculations. Dr. Harold Pemberton stood at the door, his usually neat appearance somewhat disheveled, carrying a leather satchel that bulged with books and specimen jars. At 48, the doctor had the eager energy of a much younger man when pursuing his scientific interests. "Mr. Romano, I heard from Father O'Brien that you'd found something unusual at the Blackwood Crypt. Moss, he said?" "Growing on limestone?" The mason showed him the samples, and Pemberton's eyes lit up like a child's on Christmas morning. He produced a portable microscope from his satchel, apparently carrying it around in hope of just such opportunities. "Fascinating. This appears to be Bryum argenteum, silver moss, but with unusual pigmentation. See these structures? They're producing some kind of red compound, possibly an iron-based protein." They spent 2 hours examining the samples, Pemberton growing increasingly excited. He explained how certain organisms could metabolize iron, creating rust-like compounds as waste products. In the right conditions, moisture, temperature, pH balance, this moss could indeed produce a red discharge that would look remarkably like blood, especially on pale limestone. "And these conditions," the mason asked, "would they vary with, say, the tides?" Pemberton's eyebrows rose. "Certainly. Marrow Hill's water table is influenced by tidal action. During the highest tides, particularly during full moons, groundwater would rise, potentially reaching the crypt's foundation. If this water is iron-rich from the limestone, and if it interacts with the moss..." He trailed off, scribbling calculations in a notebook. That evening, the mason walked through Marrow Hill's streets, observing the town as if seeing it for the first time. The old families still lived in federal-style houses near the common, while newer arrivals, Irish, Italian, Portuguese, clustered in smaller homes near the defunct textile mill. The Prohibition had changed things, of course. The town's 2 hotels did steady business with travelers from Boston who came for the sea air and stayed for the bootleg whiskey that somehow always appeared at dinner. He stopped at McKinnon's General Store for tobacco, finding old Samuel McKinnon deep in conversation with 2 other merchants about the upcoming mayoral election. "Theodore Blackwood's backing Harrison," McKinnon was saying. "Wants to bring in more banking business from Boston. And Jasper's supporting O'Malley," another added, "though what support a failed businessman can offer is anyone's guess." The mason purchased his tobacco silently, but he filed the information away. The Blackwood brothers' opposition extended beyond family matters, it seemed. Political divisions in a small town could be as bitter as any family feud, sometimes more so. Walking home, he passed the Blackwood house itself, a massive Georgian structure that dominated Elm Street. Lights burned in several windows despite the late hour. Through one he glimpsed Margaret Blackwood at a writing desk, her pen moving steadily across paper. She looked up suddenly, as if sensing observation, and their eyes met across the darkness. She didn't look away, didn't draw the curtain. Instead, she simply watched him watching her, until he touched his cap and continued walking. Back in his apartment, the mason made careful notes about everything he'd learned. The natural explanation for the bleeding was taking shape, but something still bothered him. If the phenomenon was purely natural, why did it seem to disturb the Blackwoods so deeply? Theodore's dismissal had seemed forced, while Jasper embraced it too eagerly. And Margaret, what was her interest in all this? He thought about his father's stories of the old country, where every village had its mysteries, its cursed places. But behind every curse, his father would say, is usually just a man who benefits from fear. Who benefited from the Blackwood curse? Or perhaps the better question was, who would benefit from proving it real or false? October 14th brought rain that turned the cemetery paths to mud and made the work of hauling materials to the crypt a miserable endeavor. The mason and Tommy had started early, hoping to beat the weather, but New England autumn had its own schedule. By noon, they were soaked through, their boots squelching with each step as they mixed mortar under a canvas tarp they'd stretched between two elm trees. The crypt's interior offered refuge from the rain, but not from the damp. Everything felt clammy to the touch. The stones, the iron gate, even the air itself seemed thick with moisture. Perfect conditions, the mason thought, for observing how water moved through the structure. He'd brought ceramic pipes and rubber tubing to create drainage channels, but first he needed to understand the existing water patterns. Tommy worked on the exterior, carefully removing damaged mortar from between stones while the mason examined the interior walls. The moss grew more abundantly here, particularly in the northeast corner, where a hairline crack in the foundation allowed groundwater to seep through. He scraped samples into several jars, labeling each with its precise location. The moss had different colorations depending on its position. Deeper red near the floor, lighter pink at shoulder height, almost gray near the ceiling where moisture was minimal. "Someone's coming," Tommy called from outside, his voice carrying a note of warning. Margaret Blackwood entered the crypt with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there, though her dove-gray dress and delicate boots seemed unsuited to the muddy conditions. She carried a small basket covered with checkered cloth. "I thought you might appreciate some lunch," she said, her voice carrying a trace of Boston finishing school. "Working in such conditions must be exhausting." The mason accepted the basket with appropriate thanks, though he wondered at her real purpose. Ladies of Margaret's station didn't typically deliver meals to workmen, especially not in the rain. She lingered, running her fingers along one of the sarcophagi, her father-in-law's parents, according to the inscription. "My husband thinks I'm foolish to be interested in the family history," she said, not quite addressing either of them directly. "But when you marry into a family like the Blackwoods, you inherit their ghosts along with their name." She moved to the wall where the stains were most prominent, studying them with an intensity that seemed more scientific than casual. "I used to conduct seances, you know, before I married Theodore. Oh, the stories the dead would tell, or that we'd pretend they told." A small, bitter smile crossed her face. "I learned to read people's desires and fears, to give them the messages they needed to hear. It's not so different from banking, really. Theodore and I understand each other in that way." The mason continued working, but he observed her carefully. There was something performative about her presence, as if she was delivering lines she'd rehearsed. Tommy had gone silent, overwhelmed by the presence of a real Blackwood lady in their workspace. "The moss," she said suddenly, "it's quite beautiful in its way, isn't it? Like nature's way of decorating death." She bent closer to examine a particularly vibrant patch. "I've seen it glowing, you know. On foggy nights there's a phosphorescence to it, quite otherworldly." Before the mason could respond, she straightened and moved toward the door. "October 21st, she said, "the full moon. You should observe it then, for your work, of course, to fully understand what needs repairing." She left as suddenly as she'd arrived, leaving behind only the basket and the lingering scent of lavender. Tommy whistled low once she was gone. "That was strange, wasn't it, sir? The way she talked about the moss." "Strange indeed."
The Mason unpacked the basket, finding not only sandwiches and coffee, but also a small notebook, Margaret's apparently, filled with observations about the crypt dating back 3 years, dates, weather conditions, and descriptions of the bleeding phenomenon.
She'd been studying this systematically, like a naturalist observing migration patterns. The rain intensified in the afternoon, and they were forced to suspend work. Back at the workshop, the Masons studied Margaret's notebook, while Tommy organized their tools. She'd noted that the bleeding was most pronounced during spring tides, when the full moon coincided with the moon's closest approach to Earth. She'd also observed that certain sections of the wall remained dry, even during the worst episodes, creating a pattern that seemed almost intentional. Dr. Pemberton arrived at 4 o'clock, eager to share his research. "I've been corresponding with a colleague at Harvard," he said, shaking rain from his coat. "This species of moss, with its ion processing capability, it's extremely rare. Found in only a few locations worldwide, always in areas with specific geological conditions." He produced a map, marking locations with red ink. "Here, near iron mines in Cornwall. Here, in certain caves in the Carpathian Mountains. And here," he pointed to a spot on the Massachusetts coast, "the Hartwell Quarry, where your crypt's stone originated." The pieces were fitting together, but the picture they formed raised new questions. How had the moss traveled from the quarry to the crypt? It couldn't have survived in the stone during construction. The lime mortar would have killed it. Someone must have introduced it later, deliberately. That evening, Father O'Brien visited the workshop, ostensibly to discuss the church cornerstone, but really to gossip about the day's events. "Margaret Blackwood visiting the cemetery in the rain," he said, shaking his head. "That'll set tongues wagging. She's an odd one, always has been. Did you know she still has her medium's equipment?" Theodore made her promise to give it up, but she kept it all. The crystal balls, the speaking trumpets, the whole theatrical kit. The Mason listened while cleaning his tools, a ritual that helped him think. The natural explanation for the bleeding crypt was clear now, but the human element, who knew what, who wanted what, remained murky. Theodore wanted the phenomenon stopped. Jasper seemed to want it validated. And Margaret? What did Margaret want? Mrs. Rossetti brought dinner, fussing over his wet clothes and insisting he drink her special tea made with herbs from the old country. "You're getting involved with those people," she said, worry creasing her face. "Nothing good comes from getting tangled in old family troubles. My grandmother used to say, 'When the rich fight, the poor bleed.'" Wise words, but the Mason had taken the commission, and his professional pride demanded he complete it properly. Still, he made a mental note to be more careful, to document everything thoroughly. In his experience, when natural phenomena intersected with human ambition, someone always tried to exploit the situation. That night, he dreamed of moss growing on stone, spreading like blood through water, while Margaret Blackwood's voice echoed through empty crypts, conducting seances for the living rather than the dead. The morning of October 21st arrived with unusual warmth for late autumn, what the old-timers called false summer, nature's last deception before winter's truth. The Mason had spent the previous days preparing for tonight's full moon observation, gathering lanterns, sample containers, and a camera borrowed from Dr. Pemberton. Tommy had been unusually quiet all week, ever since his mother had forbidden him from working at the crypt after dark. The boy's absence tonight would be felt, but perhaps it was better. Fewer witnesses meant fewer complications. Dr.
Pemberton met him at the cemetery gates at dusk, carrying his own collection of scientific instruments, including a barometer, a tide chart, and several glass vials of chemical reagents. His excitement was palpable, the kind that made him look younger than his 48 years. "The tide peaks at 9:17 tonight," he said, consulting his notes. "If our hypothesis is correct, that's when we should see maximum seepage." They worked methodically, setting up measuring stakes around the crypt's exterior and placing collection trays beneath the areas where staining was most pronounced. The mason had brought a thermometer to measure the temperature differential between the stone and the air. Condensation might play a role in the phenomenon. Inside the crypt, they positioned lanterns to illuminate the walls without creating shadows that might obscure their observations. By 8 o'clock, the moon had risen full and bright, casting the cemetery in silver light that made every headstone seem to glow. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since sunset, and moisture began beading on the crypt's exterior walls. Normal condensation, nothing more. Yet, at 8:30, the first sign appeared, a darkening along the mortar lines in the northeast corner, barely visible even with the lanterns. The mason pressed his hand against the stone. It was noticeably cooler than the surrounding blocks, and slightly damp. He scraped a sample of the moisture into a vial while Pemberton took photographs, the magnesium flash briefly turning night into harsh day. "Look," Pemberton whispered, though there was no one to overhear. "The moss is changing." He was right. The patches of reddish moss seemed to be swelling, becoming more vibrant in color. Under Pemberton's magnifying glass, they could see tiny droplets forming on the moss's surface, like perspiration on skin. The droplets were deep red, almost black in the lantern light. By 9 o'clock, the phenomenon was in full display. Red fluid seeped from dozens of points along the wall, following the mortar lines down in meandering streams that did indeed resemble blood, or tears, depending on one's poetic inclination. The mason collected samples while Pemberton measured the flow rate, both men so absorbed in their work that they didn't notice the figure watching from beyond the iron fence until she spoke. "Magnificent, isn't it?" Margaret Blackwood stepped through the gate, dressed in a dark cloak that made her seem part of the shadows. "Every month, regular as clockwork, or should I say, regular as the tides." The mason straightened slowly, aware that they'd been caught trespassing, technically. He had permission to work on the crypt, but not necessarily to conduct experiments at night. Margaret seemed unconcerned with such distinctions. She approached the bleeding wall with the confidence of someone who'd done this many times before. "You've maintained it," the mason said. Not a question, sudden understanding made it a statement. She smiled, the expression barely visible in the moonlight. "Maintained it, encouraged it, fed it, you might say." She produced a small vial from her cloak, containing what looked like rusty water. "Iron sulfate solution. The moss thrives on it. I've been applying it monthly for 3 years, always a few nights before the full moon, giving it time to absorb into the stone." Pemberton's scientific excitement warred visibly with his social shock. But why?" "Insurance," Margaret replied simply. "Theodore controls everything, the money, the house, the decisions about his father's care. But if the family curse were real, if it could be proven that the Blackwood line is tainted," she shrugged elegantly. "Well, that might affect certain legal matters, mightn't it?"
The Mason understood suddenly. Inheritance law could be complex when questions of mental capacity arose. If the family was deemed cursed or suffering from hereditary madness, previous wills might be contested, competency might be questioned. It was a long game Margaret was playing, patient and calculated. "Jasper knows," she continued, moving to examine their equipment with interest. "Or rather, he suspects. He wants to believe in the curse so desperately that he's never questioned why it's gotten so much worse these past 3 years. He thinks the family's sins are finally catching up. Theodore, for all his pragmatism, is secretly terrified of it. His rationalism is a shell around a very superstitious core." "And Cornelius?" Pemberton asked. Margaret's expression softened slightly. "My father-in-law is dying. The consumption is real, not caused by any curse. But he's also tormented by this," she gestured at the bleeding walls, "believing it's judgment for his family's crimes. Crimes that were very real, Doctor. The Blackwoods made their fortune in ways that would horrify you. Cornelius knows the family history better than anyone, and the guilt is eating him faster than the disease." The Mason watched the red streams continuing their descent, understanding now that he was witnessing not a natural phenomenon, but a carefully orchestrated performance. The moss was real, its properties genuine, but its presence here was entirely artificial. "What do you want from us?" he asked. "Nothing," Margaret said. "Continue your work. Submit your report. Tell them what you've found, that it's moss and iron and tides, nothing supernatural. Theodore will be relieved and will pay you handsomely to fix it. Jasper will be devastated but will recover, and I'll adapt my plans accordingly." She turned to leave, then paused. "You're wondering about my morality, Mr. Romano. Consider this. I'm using theater and chemistry to claim what should have been mine anyway. Theodore's family destroyed mine in business dealings 40 years ago. My marriage was my father's last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. I learned to love Theodore, in a way, but love and justice aren't always the same thing." After she left, the two men continued their observations in silence. The bleeding reached its peak at 9:20, just as Pemberton had predicted, then gradually subsided. By 10:30, only faint traces of moisture remained on the walls. They packed their equipment methodically, both lost in thought. Walking back through the cemetery, Pemberton finally spoke. "What will you tell them?" The Mason considered carefully. "The truth. That it's moss and iron and groundwater. How the moss got there, who's been feeding it, that's not my business to tell. I'm hired to repair stone, not to judge the living." But even as he said it, he knew the situation wouldn't remain that simple. Truth had a way of demanding to be fully told, not parceled out in convenient portions. Cornelius Blackwood looked like death negotiating for a few more days. October 25th found the Masons summoned to the family mansion, not for payment or consultation, but because the dying patriarch had demanded to see the Italian who speaks to stones. The butler who'd delivered the message had been apologetic but insistent. Mr. Blackwood Sr. was not to be denied. The mansion's interior carried that particular oppressive grandeur that old money cultivated. All dark wood and heavy curtains, portraits of stern ancestors watching from every wall. The Mason was led upstairs to a bedroom that smelled of medicine and decay, where Cornelius lay propped against pillows that made his skin look even more yellow than it was. "Leave us," the old man wheezed at the nurse, who departed with obvious relief. Cornelius studied the Mason with eyes that remained sharp, despite his body's deterioration. "You've seen it, haven't you? The bleeding. What is it, God's judgment?
or nature's accident. The mason chose his words carefully. It's moss, Mr. Blackwood, a rare type that processes iron from the stone and groundwater. Combined with the tidal influence, moss, Cornelius laughed, a sound like paper tearing. 67 years of fearing divine retribution, and it's moss. He coughed, specks of blood appearing on his handkerchief. My grandfather murdered his business partner, you know, pushed him off a ship in a storm. My father destroyed 3 families financially to build our fortune, and He stopped, breathing laboriously. The mason waited. In his experience, the dying often needed to confess to someone outside their circle, someone who could hear their sins without judgment or consequence. I let my youngest brother take the blame for embezzlement I'd committed, Cornelius continued. He hanged himself in shame. I was 23, thought I was protecting the family name. Now I'm dying, and the stones bleed moss. Another horrible laugh. There's justice in that, isn't there? Our crimes were real, but our punishment is theater. Before the mason could respond, the door opened. Theodore entered, his face darkening when he saw the visitor. Father, you should be resting. I'll have eternity to rest soon enough. Cornelius waved a skeletal hand at the mason. Fix it. Stop the bleeding. I want to die, knowing it's just moss, not my grandmother's curse. Can you do that? The mason nodded. I can remove the moss, seal the stones, install proper drainage. The phenomenon won't recur. Good. Theodore, pay him double, triple, whatever it takes. Cornelius closed his eyes, exhausted by the conversation. Theodore gestured sharply for the mason to follow him out. In the hallway, his controlled facade cracked slightly. How quickly can you complete the work? 2 weeks, if the weather holds. Make it 1. Father doesn't have 2 weeks. Theodore's voice carried an unexpected note of genuine emotion. Despite everything, despite what he was, he's still my father. That evening, Tommy was waiting at the workshop, pacing nervously. The boy's usual enthusiasm had been replaced by something furtive and guilty. Sir, I need to tell you something. I've done something terrible. The mason set down his tools and waited. Tommy pulled out a folded paper, a page from the mason's own notebook covered with his early observations about the crypt. Notes that suggested supernatural causes written before he'd understood the scientific explanation. Mr. Jasper Blackwood offered me $50 for anything that proved the curse was real. Tommy confessed miserably. $50, sir. That's enough to... I thought it wouldn't matter. Just copies of old notes. But now he's saying he'll use them at some kind of legal hearing, and I... The boy was near tears. The mason felt disappointment heavy as stone in his chest. Not anger. He'd learned long ago that anger was just disappointment wearing armor. When did you give him these? 3 days ago. Sir, I'm sorry, Go home, Tommy. The mason's voice was quiet. Think about what you've done. Think about what kind of craftsman you want to be. Come back tomorrow with your answer. After the boy left, the mason sat in his workshop's dimness, considering the implications. Jasper had evidence, however misinterpreted, that could be used to challenge his father's mental capacity or Theodore's inheritance. Margaret had her moss and her monthly performances. Theodore had his desperate need for normalcy. And somewhere in the middle of all these schemes, an old man was dying, tormented by crimes real and imagined. Mrs. Rossetti brought dinner, her usual fussing subdued. She could read his moods better than most. The boy? She asked simply. He made a mistake. We all do." She made a dismissive sound. "Some mistakes are from weakness, some from malice. The boy's is weakness. That can be fixed. Malice, that's harder." Later that evening, Dr. Pemberton arrived with disturbing news. "I've been researching the legal precedents Jasper might use. There was a case in 1891, Hartford versus Hartford, where evidence of persistent familial delusion was used to break an inheritance. If he can convince a judge that the Blackwood family suffers from hereditary madness manifested in their belief in the curse—" "But it's not madness if the bleeding is real," the Mason pointed out. "No, but if they've believed in a curse for generations, made decisions based on that belief, allowed it to influence their business and personal affairs, that pattern could be construed as delusional thinking, regardless of the bleeding's cause." The Mason understood suddenly why Margaret had been so confident. She hadn't just been creating evidence of a curse, she'd been documenting the family's reaction to it. Every month, their fear and superstition reinforced the narrative of inherited instability. Through his window, he could see the lights of the Blackwood mansion on the hill. How many schemes were unfolding behind those windows? How many plots and counterplots, all circling around a dying man's fortune? His father had been right to warn him about working for old money. But his father had also taught him that a craftsman's first duty was to his craft. The stones needed repair, regardless of the human drama surrounding them.
Tomorrow, he would begin removing the moss, installing the drainage, sealing the walls. He would do his work with the same care he brought to every job, whether for a poor farmer or a wealthy dynasty. The Blackwoods could sort out their own curses. His business was with stone and mortar, substances that at least had the decency to follow natural laws. Tommy returned at dawn on October 28th, his face drawn but determined. The Mason found him already at work in the shop, organizing tools with meticulous care, the kind of attention that came from a guilty conscience seeking redemption. They worked in silence for an hour before the boy finally spoke. "I want to make it right, sir. Tell me how." The Mason considered while mixing a batch of sealant for the crypt work. "Right and wrong aren't always simple in situations like these, Tommy. You've learned that taking money for betraying trust has a cost higher than any payment. That's the lesson. As for making it right—" He paused, measuring his words. "Sometimes the best we can do is refuse to make things worse." They loaded the cart with supplies, buckets of specially mixed mortar, copper pipes for drainage, blocks of new limestone to replace the most damaged stones, and containers of chemical solution to kill the moss without damaging the stone. The work would be grueling, but the Mason had given his word to complete it in a week. At the crypt, they found an unexpected visitor. Jasper Blackwood sat on a stone bench nearby, apparently drunk despite the early hour. His clothes were disheveled, his eyes bloodshot. "Come to destroy the evidence?" he called out, his words slightly slurred. "Theodore's paying you well for that, I'm sure." The Mason continued unloading supplies without responding. He'd learned that engaging with drunk men rarely improved any situation. But Jasper wasn't finished. He stood unsteadily, pulling out a familiar piece of paper, Tommy's stolen notes. "I have proof," he announced. "Your own observations about the unnatural nature of the phenomenon. You wrote that the pattern suggested an intelligence behind the manifestation. Your words, Master Romano." Tommy went pale, but the Mason simply continued his work.
Those were preliminary observations, Mr. Blackwood, before I understood the science involved. Science, Jasper laughed bitterly. Everything's science now, isn't it? No room for mystery or meaning, just moss and minerals and tides. He swayed slightly. My father's dying, you know. This morning, maybe tomorrow, and Theodore gets everything. Everything! Because he was born 2 years earlier. Where's the science in that? The mason finally stopped working and faced the younger Blackwood. Your quarrel isn't with science or curses, Mr. Blackwood. It's with primogeniture. That's a human law, not a natural one. Something shifted in Jasper's expression, a moment of clarity through the alcohol fog. You're right, he said quietly. But human laws are the only ones that matter when you're human. He crumpled the notes suddenly, letting them fall to the ground. It doesn't matter anyway. Margaret's already won. Before the mason could ask what he meant, Jasper walked away, his gait becoming steadier with each step, as if confession had sobered him. They worked through the morning, carefully removing moss-infected mortar and treating each stone with the killing solution. The moss died quickly when exposed to the copper-based compound, turning black and falling away like old scabs. Tommy worked with unusual focus, as if trying to scrub away his guilt along with the moss. At midday, Father O'Brien arrived with sandwiches from Mrs. Rossetti and news from the Blackwood mansion. Cornelius is asking for you, he told the mason. He wants to know about the progress. Theodore tried to put him off, but the old man insists. The mason didn't want to leave the work, but refusing a dying man's request seemed wrong. He left Tommy to continue treating the stones and followed the priest to the mansion. The house felt different from his last visit, quieter, heavier, like the building itself was holding its breath. Cornelius was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and labored. Theodore stood by the window while Margaret sat beside the bed, holding the old man's hand with what appeared to be genuine tenderness. Whatever her schemes, she seemed to have developed real affection for her father-in-law. "The stones," Cornelius whispered when he saw the mason. "The moss is dying, sir. By tomorrow, it'll be gone. The drainage will prevent water accumulation. The crypt will be dry and solid." Cornelius smiled slightly. "No more blood tears. Good. Good." He turned his head toward Theodore. "You see? Just moss. Remember that. When you're my age, when the guilt comes at night, remember, it was just moss." Theodore's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Margaret caught the mason's eye and gave him a look he couldn't interpret. Gratitude? Warning? Outside the room, Theodore stopped him. "Mr. Romano, I need to know, have you spoken to anyone about your findings? Written any reports?" "I keep notes from my work, nothing more." Theodore pulled out his checkbook. "I'd like to purchase those notes, all of them, and your discretion about this entire matter." The mason felt the familiar weight of being asked to participate in a rich man's conspiracy. "My work notes are my own, Mr. Blackwood. They help me improve my craft. As for discretion, that comes free with professional service." Theodore's face darkened, but before he could respond, a cry came from the bedroom. They rushed back to find Cornelius in the grip of a violent coughing fit, blood speckling his nightshirt. The nurse pushed past them, administering morphine, while Margaret held the old man steady. The mason left quietly, understanding he'd witnessed something more private than death. A family's raw moment of transition from one generation's sins to another's inheritance. Back at the crypt, he found Tommy had made excellent progress.
Half the infected stones were treated, their surfaces already looking cleaner. But the boy was troubled. "Mr. Jasper was here again," he said. "He asked me to testify about the notes. Said he'd pay me another $50. And I told him no." Tommy met his eyes steadily. "I told him I was done with that business." The Mason nodded, returning to work. Trust, once broken, took time to rebuild, like mortar that needed proper curing to regain its strength. But the boy had made his choice, and that was a beginning.
As the afternoon sun slanted through the cemetery trees, casting long shadows across their work, the Mason thought about inheritance, not just of money or property, but of guilt, of patterns, of the stories families told themselves. The Blackwoods would continue their drama with or without bleeding stones. He was just the craftsman, cleaning up one small part of their mess, making the stones honest again. November 11th arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made stones crack and hearts grow heavy. The Mason heard the church bells tolling before dawn. Cornelius Blackwood had died in the night. The sound echoed across Marrow Hill like a pronouncement, marking the end of an era and the beginning of what promised to be an ugly battle over its remains. The work at the crypt was nearly complete. The moss had been eradicated, the drainage installed, new mortar sealed every suspicious gap. The walls stood clean and dry, looking somehow naked without their bloody tears. Tommy was putting finishing touches on the replaced stones when Theodore Blackwood arrived, dressed in mourning black that made his pale face seem carved from marble. "It's done then," Theodore said, surveying their work with the eye of a man calculating value. "No more bleeding." "No more bleeding," the Mason confirmed. "The drainage channels will carry groundwater away from the foundation. The sealant will prevent moisture penetration. Your family crypt is now simply what it appears, stone and mortar, nothing more." Theodore produced an envelope, thick with bills. "Your payment, plus the bonus my father promised. There's also an additional sum for your comprehensive discretion about everything you've observed." The Mason took the envelope without counting it. Money from the Blackwoods felt heavier than it should, weighted with implications. Theodore started to leave, then turned back. "The will reading is tomorrow." "My brother has suggested he might contest it, claims father wasn't of sound mind. These notes your apprentice sold him are preliminary observations, nothing more. If asked to testify, I'll tell the truth. The phenomenon had a natural explanation." Theodore's smile was thin as winter ice. "The truth? Yes, that should suffice." After he left, Tommy approached nervously. "Sir, Mrs. Rossetti is ill, very ill. She's been hiding it, but this morning she collapsed. The doctor's with her now." The Mason's chest tightened. Eleanor Rossetti had been his anchor in Marrow Hill, the one person whose concern for him carried no ulterior motive. He left Tommy to finish the final details and hurried home. Dr. Pemberton met him at Mrs. Rossetti's door, his face grave. "Pneumonia, I'm afraid. Both lungs. She's been fighting it for days without telling anyone." He lowered his voice. "At her age, with the inflammation this advanced?" The Mason understood. He entered her room to find her propped up in bed, her breathing labored but her eyes still sharp. "Don't look like that," she wheezed. "I'm not dead yet." He sat beside her bed, taking her hand. It felt like holding a bird's bones wrapped in paper. "Why didn't you tell me you were sick? You had your important work. Those rich people with their problems," she coughed weakly.
I've buried a husband and 3 sons. I know when my time comes." They sat in silence for a while, her breathing the only sound. Then she spoke again, softer. "That family, those Blackwoods, you stay clear of them after this, promise me." "The work is finished." "The work maybe, but those people, they make trouble stick to everyone near them." She squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "You're a good man, like my boys would have been." The Masons stayed with her through the afternoon, while November wind rattled the windows and the room grew colder despite the furnace's best efforts. Father O'Brien came to perform last rites, his Latin words falling like autumn leaves, beautiful, inevitable, marking an ending. That evening, while Mrs. Rossetti slept fitfully, the Mason received an unexpected visitor. Margaret Blackwood stood at his workshop door, still in morning dress but with an air of urgency that had nothing to do with grief. "Tomorrow's will reading," she said without preamble. "Jasper plans to present your notes as evidence. He's also hired a spiritualist, a real one, not a charlatan, to testify about the family's psychic disturbances. He's desperate." "Why tell me this?" She smiled, that calculating expression he'd come to recognize. "Because I want you there, as a witness. Theodore trusts you now, oddly enough. Your testimony about the natural causes will carry weight. More importantly, your presence will unsettle Jasper." The Mason shook his head. "I have responsibilities here. Mrs. Rossetti is dying," Margaret said bluntly. "I'm sorry, truly. But she'll die whether you're at her bedside or in a lawyer's office. And your testimony tomorrow could determine whether Theodore inherits cleanly or spends years in legal battles. Why do you care? You have your moss, your evidence of instability." Margaret's expression shifted, becoming almost vulnerable. "Because I'm pregnant. Theodore doesn't know yet. This child will be a Blackwood, will inherit whatever comes from tomorrow's decision. I've played my games, yes, but now I need stability, not chaos." The Mason studied her face, searching for deception but finding what seemed to be truth. The schemes of the wealthy grew ever more complex, layers upon layers like geological strata. "If I testify, I tell only what I know about the stones, nothing else. That's all I ask." After she left, the Mason returned to Mrs. Rossetti's bedside. She was awake, her eyes fever bright. "You're going to help them," she said. Not a question. "I'm going to tell the truth about stones and moss." She laughed weakly. "The truth. Such a simple word for such a complicated thing." She patted his hand. "Go. Do what you must. But remember, stones don't care about human truth. They just endure." That night the Mason sat in his workshop, surrounded by his father's tools and his own careful notes. Tomorrow he would enter the world of lawyers and inheritance, where truth was negotiable and justice was bought. But tonight he had his own vigil to keep. He worked on a small piece of marble he'd been saving, beginning to carve what would become Elena Rossetti's headstone. Each chip of stone was a prayer, each line a memory. The November wind howled outside, rattling the windows like the dead demanding entrance. But inside, there was only the sound of chisel on stone, the ancient rhythm of craftsmanship that connected him to every Mason who'd ever lived. Tomorrow would bring its complications, but tonight he honored the simple truth of loss with the only language he trusted completely, the patient work of hands on stone. The law offices of Whitmore, Carrington, and Associates occupied the second floor of Marrow Hill's only bank building, a granite edifice that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who entered without sufficient funds. The Mason arrived at precisely 10 o'clock on November 12th, wearing his only good suit, the one he'd bought for his father's funeral 15 years ago. The wool still smelled faintly of mothballs and old grief. The reading room was already crowded. Theodore sat rigid at one end of the long mahogany table, Margaret beside him with her hand resting on his arm, a gesture that might have been support or control.
Jasper occupied the opposite end, flanked by a thin lawyer who kept shuffling papers, and a woman in purple velvet who could only be the spiritualist, Madame Zelenko, according to the brass nameplate before her. Judge Harrison Whitmore, senior partner and executor of Cornelius's will, presided from the table's head like a gray-bearded Moses preparing to divide the sea. Dr. Pemberton was there too, having been summoned as a potential witness, along with Father O'Brien and, surprisingly, Tommy, who looked terrified by the august company. "Before we read the will," Judge Whitmore began, "I understand there are challenges to be presented regarding the testator's mental capacity." Jasper's lawyer stood immediately. "We contend that Cornelius Blackwood was suffering from hereditary delusion, specifically the belief in a family curse manifested through supernatural phenomena at the family crypt. This delusion affected his judgment in all matters, including the disposition of his estate." He presented the Mason's preliminary notes with a flourish. "These observations, made by a respected craftsman, describe unnatural and seemingly intelligent patterns in the so-called bleeding phenomenon." The Mason was called to explain. He stood slowly, aware of every eye upon him. "Those notes were written before I understood the mechanism. The phenomenon is entirely natural, a combination of iron-rich limestone, a species of moss that metabolizes iron, and tidal groundwater fluctuations." "But you initially believed it's supernatural?" Jasper's lawyer pressed. "I initially didn't understand it. There's a difference between mystery and mysticism. Once I applied proper observation and scientific method, the explanation became clear." Madame Zelenko was called next. She spoke in heavily accented English about psychic disturbances and generational spiritual debt, her hands moving dramatically as she described the dark aura surrounding the Blackwood family. The Mason noticed Margaret watching with barely concealed amusement, one former spiritualist recognizing another's performance. Then Theodore's lawyer called Dr. Pemberton, who explained in exhaustive scientific detail the exact mechanism of the bleeding, complete with chemical formulas and tidal charts. Judge Whitmore's eyes began to glaze over halfway through the explanation of iron oxide solubility. "The essential point," Pemberton concluded, "is that the phenomenon, while unusual, is entirely consistent with natural law. No curse required." "But Cornelius Blackwood believed in the curse," Jasper's lawyer countered. "That belief influenced his decisions." Father O'Brien was called to testify about Cornelius's state of mind. The priest chose his words carefully. "Cornelius was troubled by his family's history, yes, but what man isn't when facing death? He sought spiritual comfort, not because he was delusional, but because he was human." The arguments continued for 2 hours, then Margaret stood suddenly, her movement commanding attention. "May I speak?" Judge Whitmore nodded, though she hadn't been scheduled as a witness. "My father-in-law believed in many things," she said, her voice clear and steady. "He believed in hard work, in family obligation, in the weight of history.
Yes, he also believed in the possibility of divine judgment for his family's sins. But belief in cosmic justice doesn't make one insane. It makes one moral. She paused, then delivered her killing blow. If we declare everyone who believes in the supernatural insane, we'd have to empty every church, dismiss every judge who swears on a Bible, and discount every soldier who prays before battle. Cornelius Blackwood was many things, but he was competent when he made his will. Then she produced a document from her bag. Besides, this is all moot. This is a codicil to the will, signed 3 days before Cornelius died, witnessed by Dr. Pemberton and Father O'Brien. It doesn't change the main disposition, but adds a provision, $30,000 to establish a geological museum in Marrow Hill with specific funds for the study of local mineral phenomena. The Mason saw Jasper's face crumble. His father had used his last days to transform the curse into science, to fund education where superstition had reigned. It was, in its way, a perfect rebuke to both sons, to Theodore's dismissal of wonder and Jasper's embrace of delusion. Judge Whitmore reviewed the codicil, confirmed the witnesses, and nodded. The will stands as written. Theodore Blackwood inherits the bulk of the estate. Jasper Blackwood receives his specified portion of $20,000 and the summer cottage in Gloucester. Jasper stood abruptly and left without a word. His lawyer and the spiritualist followed, the latter muttering something that might have been a curse, or might have been simply disappointment at losing her fee. Theodore shook the Mason's hand formally. "Thank you for your testimony. Your final payment will be delivered tomorrow." But Margaret lingered, catching the Mason at the door. "Thank you," she said simply. "The truth served everyone today, even if they don't realize it." "The moss," he began, "is dead thanks to your work. The bleeding has stopped. My child will grow up with stories of the family curse as history, not living fear." She smiled slightly. "Though I kept one small sample, pressed in a book, a reminder that sometimes the most effective lies are mostly truth." The Mason left the bank building feeling unsettled. Justice had been served, perhaps, but he couldn't shake the feeling that everyone had lost something in that room. Innocence, illusion, or simple faith in the straightforward nature of truth. He returned to find Mrs. Rossetti worse, her breathing shallow and irregular. Tommy was there, having followed him from the hearing, keeping vigil while the Mason was away. "She asked for you," the boy said quietly. The Mason sat beside her bed, taking her cold hand. She opened her eyes, seeing him without quite focusing. "The rich people," she whispered, "sorted out their problems, as rich people do." She smiled weakly. "Good. Now you can focus on important things." Her hand squeezed his. "Take care of my garden. The tomatoes especially. They need someone who understands patience." She died that evening as the last light faded from the November sky. The Mason and Tommy sat with her until Father O'Brien came to perform the final offices. Tomorrow there would be arrangements to make, a stone to finish carving, a garden to tend through winter's approach. But tonight, in the stillness of loss, the Mason understood that some mysteries, love, loyalty, the grace of ordinary kindness, were worth more than any rich man's inheritance. 3 weeks had passed since the will reading, and November 25th brought the first real snow of winter to Marrow Hill. The mason stood in the cemetery's east corner, where the modest graves lay in neat rows, finishing the final details on Elena Rossetti's headstone. The marble, Carrara, imported at considerable expense but worth it for her, gleamed white against the dark earth. He'd carved roses along the border, each petal a meditation on her kindness. Tommy worked beside him on a simple granite marker for a fisherman's widow, his technique much improved over these past weeks. The boy had returned the $50 to Jasper Blackwood, delivering it in person despite his fear. That act of restitution had changed something in him, transformed his shame into a quieter, more careful pride in his work. "Someone's coming," Tommy said, looking up from his carving. Dr. Pemberton approached through the snow, carrying his ever-present satchel and something else, a wooden crate that he set down carefully beside them. "I thought you should see this," he said, opening the crate to reveal several specimens of the red moss, preserved in glass containers. "I've been corresponding with Harvard. They want to name it after you, Bryum Romanum. You'd be immortalized in scientific nomenclature." The mason smiled slightly. "Let them name it after the quarry. The stone deserves the credit more than I do." Pemberton laughed. "Ever the philosopher. Speaking of which, I have news. Jasper Blackwood has left for California. Says he's going to invest in motion pictures." "And Theodore has donated an additional $10,000 to the Geological Museum, specifically for educational programs about local mineralogy." The mason wasn't surprised. The Blackwood brothers had found their own ways of dealing with their father's legacy. Jasper by running from it, Theodore by transforming it into something rational and beneficial. Perhaps both responses were kinds of wisdom. "And Margaret," he asked, "announced her pregnancy last week. Theodore seems genuinely happy. They're renovating the east wing of the mansion for a nursery." Pemberton paused. "She also sent this." He handed over a small package. Inside was a piece of limestone, smooth and unmarked, with a note. "For your collection. A stone without history, without stains. Sometimes we need reminders that fresh starts are possible. M.B." The mason pocketed the stone, understanding the message. Margaret had won her game, secured her position, and was now building something new on the foundations of the old. He couldn't entirely approve of her methods, but he admired her pragmatism. Father O'Brien joined them as the sun reached its zenith, bringing a thermos of coffee and news from the town. "The old Blackwood crypt has become something of a tourist attraction," he said, shaking his head. "People come expecting to see bleeding walls. They leave disappointed by clean, dry stone." "Good," the mason said. "Let them learn that most mysteries have explanations, if we're patient enough to find them." They stood together in comfortable silence, 4 men of different backgrounds and beliefs, united by their recent shared experience. The snow continued to fall, covering the cemetery in a blanket that made all the graves equal. Rich and poor, old and new, all resting under the same white shroud. As afternoon approached, the mason began packing his tools. Tomorrow, he would start work on a new commission, a memorial for the Veterans Association, honoring the town's dead from the recent war. Simple work, honest work, without family secrets or hidden schemes. Tommy helped him load the cart, then asked, "Sir, do you ever regret taking the Blackwood job?" The mason considered. "Every job teaches us something. The Blackwoods taught me that truth isn't always simple, that even natural phenomena can carry human meaning, and that sometimes understanding a mystery doesn't diminish its power, it just changes the nature of our wonder. They walked back through the cemetery gates, passing the Blackwood section, where the crypt stood, solid and unbleeding, a monument to both family pride and family shame, now rendered honest by good craftsmanship and better drainage. That evening the mason sat in his workshop, now truly his, since Mrs. Rossetti's passing had made him heir to the building, her final gift to the man she'd considered a son. He was carving a small piece of granite, not for any commission, but for the pleasure of feeling stone yield to patient skill. Tommy had gone home to his family, Dr. Pemberton to his studies, Father O'Brien to his vespers. The mason thought about the past 2 months, about moss and blood, about inheritance and justice, about the weight of history and the possibility of redemption. The Blackwood crypt no longer bled, but the family's story continued, written now in different ink. Margaret would raise her child with full knowledge of the family's sins and glories. Theodore would build his museums and banks, creating prosperity from his father's guilt. Even Jasper in California might find his own kind of success in the land of manufactured dreams. And he, the mason, would continue his work, marking deaths, commemorating lives, giving permanence to memory through stone. It was humble work, but necessary. Someone had to remember. Someone had to carve the names and dates that would outlast the forgotten details of family feuds and elaborate schemes. Outside, snow continued to fall on Marrow Hill, covering the town's secrets and shames with temporary grace. But beneath the snow, the stones endured, honest now, cleaned of their false blood, standing as testimonies to the complex truth that even the most supernatural-seeming mysteries usually had natural explanations, though the human dramas that surrounded them were mysteries of a different kind entirely. He selected another piece of granite, running his hands over its surface, feeling for the grain, the hidden flaws, the potential within. Tomorrow he would begin the Veterans Memorial, but tonight he would practice his letters, carving words that would last longer than any of them. Truth is patient, stone remembers, time reveals all. The lamp flickered in the workshop, casting shadows that danced like the ghosts of all the stories stones could tell, if only we knew how to read them properly. The mason smiled, picked up his chisel, and began to work.